When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviets received over 130,000 Thompson submachine guns through the Lend-Lease Act with the Americans and the Brits. See, the Thompson was originally designed for American troops clearing trenches in World War I, and by the time it reached Soviet hands, it had already earned a reputation as one of the most devastating close-quarters weapons ever made. But despite the Soviets having the domestic Pepescher that is now often described as superior, the Soviet Marines actually preferred the Thompson. We're going to show you exactly why the Marines dominated the Germans in one-on-one firefights with this gun, but to understand that, you need to understand why Brigadier General John T. Thompson even made it to begin with. By 1917, the United States had entered the First World War, and the situation in France was absolutely grim. Millions of soldiers on both sides were stuck in trenches that stretched from the English Channel to Switzerland, and nobody could move forward without getting cut to pieces by machine gun fire. The standard infantry weapon at the time was the bolt-action rifle. Now that works fine if you're shooting at someone 300 meters away across an open field, but the second you jump into a trench and you're face to face with the enemy at arm's length, that rifle becomes more of a liability than a weapon. You see, Brigadier General John T. Thompson had spent most of his career in the Army's Ordnance Department, and he understood this problem better than most. He had already helped develop the M1903 Springfield rifle and the M1911 pistol, so the man knew firearms inside and out. And his idea was simple but radical for the time. He wanted to build a portable handheld machine gun that a single soldier could carry into a trench and absolutely clean house with. He called it a trench broom because the whole point was to sweep the enemy out of confined spaces with an overwhelming volume of .45 caliber rounds. Thompson found a patent by a Navy commander named John Bell Blish that described an operating principle based on how metal surfaces behave under pressure, and he used that concept to build a delayed blowback action that could handle the .45 ACP cartridge, the same round used by the Colt M1911 pistol. He set up his own company called Auto Ordnance in 1916, got funding from a wealthy businessman named Thomas Fortune Ryan, and put his engineers to work. The prototype was called the Annihilator, and by 1918 it was ready. But then something unexpected happened. The First World War ended just 2 days before the prototypes could be shipped to Europe. So Thompson had this revolutionary weapon and nobody to sell it to. The military had no interest in buying new firearms right after a war, and at $200 per unit, which was half the price of a Ford automobile at the time, the Thompson was far too expensive for most civilian buyers. The first production model rolled out in 1921, the M1921, and it came with either a 20-round stick magazine or those iconic Mafia-style 50 and 100-round drum magazines that could pour fire at around 800 rounds per minute. Auto Ordnance tried selling them to police departments and managed to sell a few hundred to the US Postal Service for guarding mail trains after a string of robberies, and even marketed them to ranchers and civilians as home defense weapons. But the biggest customers in those early years turned out to be the people Thompson never intended to sell to. Some of the very first batches of Thompsons were bought by agents of the Irish Republican Army, who smuggled them across the Atlantic and used them during the Irish War of Independence against British forces. And even Al Capone's men used Thompsons in the St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929, where 7 rival gang members were lined up against a wall and torn apart. The Thompson became the symbol of gangland violence in America, and the press gave it names like the Chicago typewriter and the Chicago piano. General Thompson was reportedly devastated by this reputation and regretted building the weapon. However, when the gun finally managed to see combat, it even surprised the enemy. In 1927, the US Marines shipped Thompsons to Nicaragua and China, and this is where the military first figured out what the Thompson could actually do in combat. In Nicaragua, the Marines were fighting guerrilla forces led by Augusto Sandino, and the jungle patrols were getting ambushed constantly. The bolt-action Springfield rifle was next to useless in thick vegetation at close range against hit-and-run fighters, and the Marines needed something that could respond fast. Marines started putting the man carrying the Thompson at the front of every patrol, and those 4-man fire teams armed with the Thompson suddenly had as much firepower as a full 9-man rifle squad. Legends like Chesty Puller and Merritt Edson cut their teeth chasing Sandinistas through that jungle with Thompsons, and the lessons they learned about close-quarters fighting in the bush would save thousands of lives in the Pacific a decade later. The Navy formally ordered 500 guns, designated the Model 1928, and from that point on, the Marines and the Thompson were inseparable. But then came September 1939, and the whole world needed submachine guns overnight. When the Second World War broke out, the Thompson was the only submachine gun in production outside of Europe. Britain had exactly 40 Thompsons in the entire country in 1940, and those were immediately grabbed by the newly formed commandos who used them in cross-channel raids against German positions. France ordered 3,000, but they arrived too late, right as the country was falling. The US Army had formally adopted the Thompson in 1938, and by early 1942 they had purchased over 319,000 of them, with factories pushing out 10,000 a month. Over the course of the war, more than 1.5 million Thompsons were produced. Now, the original M1928-1 model was a beautifully machined weapon, but it was slow and expensive to manufacture, so in 1942 they simplified the design into the M1 and later the M1A1. They got rid of the drum magazine capability, kept only the 20 and 30 round stick magazines, swapped to a simpler blowback action, and dropped the fancy cooling fins on the barrel. The cost per gun dropped from around $200 down to about $45, and production speed went through the roof. In the European theatre they were everywhere, issued to paratroopers, rangers, scouts, NCOs, tank crews, and anyone who could beg, borrow or steal one from somebody else. Paratroopers would pinch Thompsons from mortar squads before going on patrols behind enemy lines, because at close range nothing else could match the volume of fire. During the invasion of France in 1944, the Thompson proved itself over and over again in the brutal street fighting that came with clearing town after town. In the Pacific it was a similar story. Marines used it to devastating effect during banzai charges, where the Japanese would rush positions in waves, and the Thompson's ability to throw .45 caliber rounds at 600 to 700 rounds per minute was the difference between holding your position and being overrun. There were complaints about the weight, and some soldiers ditched them on long marches, but most who carried one in actual combat absolutely refused to give it up. When the cheaper and lighter M3 grease gun was introduced as a replacement, many soldiers flat out refused to hand over their Thompsons. So now that you fully understand what the gun was capable of, let's talk about why Soviet Marines and a few other elites preferred the Thompson to the masterpiece that is the PPSH-41. In 1942, the United States started shipping massive quantities of military equipment to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program, and among the tanks, trucks, and aircraft were almost 138,000 Thompson submachine guns, along with 306 million rounds of .45 ACP ammunition. The guns arrived in two ways. Some came as individual shipments of weapons and ammo, but a large portion came as standard equipment packed inside Lend-Lease tanks like the M3 Stuart, M3 Lee, and M4 Sherman, because every American tank shipped with a Thompson for the crew. So Soviet tank crews were suddenly sitting on top of these American submachine guns whether they asked for them or not. However, most regular Red Army infantry actually wanted absolutely nothing to do with the Thompson, and you need to understand why. By 1942, the Soviets were already producing the PPSH-41 at a rate of about 3,000 units per day, and by the end of the war they had manufactured over 6 million of them. So for every single Thompson that arrived through Lend-Lease, there were roughly 45 PPSH-41s already in Soviet hands. The PPSH fired the 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev round, which was lighter, smaller, and travelled at much higher velocity than the .45 ACP. In Soviet penetration tests, the PPSH round went through 10 layers of 1-inch pinewood boards, while the Thompson's .45 ACP only managed 5. The PPSH was also lighter, simpler, and built almost entirely from stamped metal parts, meaning any factory could produce them by the thousands. On top of that, the harsh Russian winters absolutely punished the Thompson, because the finer machine tolerances of the American weapon made it far more sensitive to freezing temperatures and residue buildup than the crude but robust PPSH. And critically, the ammunition was everywhere, because the same 7.62 by 25 round was used in Soviet pistols and other submachine guns, so you could scrounge ammo from almost anyone on the battlefield, whereas the Thompson used .45 ACP, which absolutely nobody else on the Eastern Front carried, and once you ran out of the American-supplied cartridges, that was it. A reconnaissance soldier named Pavel Kolosov later recalled that the Thompsons had too wide a dispersion pattern, a limited firing range, and the cartridges were so heavy you could not carry enough of them. But there was one group of Soviet soldiers who felt completely different about the Thompson: the Soviet Naval Infantry, the Marines. See, the Soviet Naval Infantry were a breed apart from the regular Red Army. The Germans called them the Black Death because of their dark naval uniforms and their absolutely fanatical fighting style. These were not conscripts with 3 weeks of training, handed a rifle and pushed toward the front. Many of them were experienced sailors and shore personnel who volunteered for ground combat, and they fought in some of the most brutal engagements of the entire war, from the siege of Sevastopol to the defense of Stalingrad to the amphibious landings at Novorossiysk and Kerch. Over the course of the war, about 500,000 Soviet sailors served in naval infantry units, and they conducted over 114 amphibious landings. 5 brigades and 2 battalions earned guard status, and 122 naval infantrymen were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Now, the reason the naval infantry preferred the Thompson over the PPSH comes down to what kind of fighting they were actually doing. These units specialized in amphibious raids, beachhead assaults, and close quarters urban combat where engagement distances were measured in meters, not hundreds of meters, and at those ranges the Thompson had a very specific advantage that the PPSH could not match. A .45 ACP round transfers almost all of its energy into the target on impact rather than punching clean through, and against a human body at 10 or 20 meters the effect was devastating. The PPSH's lighter, faster round would often pass through a target and keep going, which meant meant less stopping power per hit in a point-blank gunfight, and the Thompson was more accurate on single-shot fire, so a Marine storming a building could actually place precise shots rather than just spraying and praying. For the naval infantry, who were kicking in doors and clearing rooms along the Black Sea coast, that combination of stopping power and close-range precision made the Thompson the better tool for their specific job. There are photographs from the Northern Fleet showing squads of Soviet naval infantry armed with Thompsons, and tank crews posed next to their Lend-Lease Stuarts and Shermans, with Thompsons slung across their chests. However, the story of the Thompson in Russia actually goes back much further than anyone might expect. Believe it or not, the Soviets had been using Thompsons since 1924, almost 2 decades before Lend-Lease even started. According to recently declassified documents, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police that would later become the KGB, secretly purchased a large number of M19-21 Thompsons through front men in Mexico. They took it seriously enough to write a full Russian language manual for the weapon and created special display boards with disassembled Thompsons so soldiers could study every component. And here is the strange part. There was an official requirement that any Red Army soldier assigned to maintain or carry a Thompson had to be a seasoned serviceman and a member of the Communist Party or Komsomol. You had to be a devoted communist to carry an American gangster gun, because party members were considered more capable and trustworthy. The NKVD issued them to border guards, prisoner escort troops, and special operations units fighting bandits in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Moscow even sent a handful of those same Thompsons to communist militants in Estonia, who used them during a failed coup attempt in Tallinn in December 1924, which may have been one of the first battles in history where submachine guns were used by both sides. So the Thompson had been lurking in Russian armories for nearly 20 years before it showed up again en masse through American supply convoys. But somehow the Thompson kept showing up in wars across the world for another 50 years, and in some cases it was still being pulled out of storage and fired well into the 21st century. After 1945, most of the Lend-Lease Thompsons in Soviet hands went straight into storage. Some of those same guns turned up during the fighting in eastern Ukraine, and even showed up in the hands of Wagner Group fighters who captured them from Ukrainian stocks. Meanwhile, in America, the Thompson stayed in active service far longer than anyone expected. The US military officially declared it obsolete in 1957, but huge stockpiles remained in arsenals. American troops carried them in Korea, where Chinese soldiers armed with captured Thompsons would rush positions in night assaults, creating the bizarre situation where both sides were killing each other with the same weapon. An American infantry captain named Hal Moore, who would later become a general, described the PPSH and captured Thompsons used by the Chinese as devastating in those close-range night fights, saying that whoever responded faster usually won. And in those situations, the submachine gun outclassed and outgunned everything else the Americans had. American and South Korean soldiers started picking up captured Chinese Thompsons from the battlefield and using them for the rest of the war because they already knew how the weapon worked and trusted it. In Vietnam, South Vietnamese troops, American Special Forces advisors, and even Viet Cong fighters who built crude copies in jungle workshops were all using Thompsons into the late 1960s. A Marine who fought in the Battle of Hue during the Tet Offensive in 1968 later recalled that for close-range combat in the city, the Thompson was effective and hard-hitting, and that he liked how a big .45 caliber slug travelling at a relatively slow velocity tended to do a lot of damage to whatever it hit. Some troops from the 7th Special Forces Group reportedly carried Thompsons during Operation Just Cause in Panama in 1989. The FBI used them as ceremonial firearms until 1976, and the US military did not officially remove the Thompson from service until 1971, giving it 33 years of continuous frontline duty. Yugoslav forces received 34,000 M1A, 1 Thompsons from the US in the 1950s, and those same guns showed up again during the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing.